Part 72. A Middle School Cartoonist. Author, Mao Do Sde Mao. Chapter 713. The bald setting, and the characters appearing in the comic Steins Gate. When you combine these two pieces of information, the first thing that comes to mind is the muscular man who has been stealing the show in the recent serialization. Yes, the one who amazed Yuichiro, and even made his new wife Ag admit defeat directly, was Yugo Tenji, who was almost a soy sauce character in the manga Steins Gate, that is, the one whom the male protagonist Rintaro Okabe called a bald muscular man for Mr. Brown. As early as when the manga Steins Gate was first serialized, Tenji Yugo had actually appeared once, but at that time it was just to highlight the Chuyunio arrogance of the male protagonist Okabe Rintaro. So this face looks like it's not like he was a good guy, he just used a name like Mr. Brown, which is almost like a spy code name, leaving a deep memory in the reader's mind. Landlords with ferocious looks and bad attitudes, in many comic settings, are mostly people with stories, and those who can have an overwhelming advantage in getting along with the protagonist are usually very remarkable beings in the past. To put it simply, she is just like the ascendant mother-in-law in the manga Gintama. In addition to the bald character of Tenji Yugo's character that impresses readers, the strong side shown by Rintaro in the Mad Shuyuni state has also become one of the few highlights of this character. Facing Rintaro, who was full of airwaves, Uncle Yugo Tenji just said the rent will go up this month, which was enough to make Rintaro Okabe, who was full of rage in the second class, instantly speechless and immediately return to the mode of a normal person. Middle. By the way, because he has a cute lowly daughter, this muscular Uncle Tenji Yugo is also the object of envy and hatred for many gentleman readers. When Tenji Yugo's muscular uncle appeared, he was identified as a spy by an arrogant middle-class scientist. Because the misunderstanding was cleared up after a while, this almost daily plot did not arouse the attention of many readers. Notice. At least until the recent serialization of the plot of recycling the D-mail sent by Kiryu Moeki, there was no such thing, and no reader would have thought that Rintaro Okabe, the protagonist, would randomly talk nonsense. And actually got it right. From the original identity of the landlord, he suddenly switched to the person in charge of instructing Kiryu Moeki's actions. It can be said that the contrast between Uncle Tenji Yugo before and after is really great. After all, for most people, things like ferocious muscular brother Goi, the guy with the first impression, is not suitable for choosing to become an undercover or spy, a profession that requires the talent of disguise. But the muscular Uncle Tenji Yugo did it. And judging from the previous serialized plots, almost 80% of Mayuri's multiple deaths were related to the instructions given by the muscular Uncle Yugo Tenji, although the one who ended up killing people was most of the time someone like Kiryu Moeku. A cute, autistic girl with glasses. At the end of the plot to eliminate the D-mail sent to Hashida Suzu, it was mentioned that Yugo Tenji, a muscular uncle, had been taken care of by Hashida Suzu, and then in the recent 3-episode serial plot, it was mentioned Yugo Tenji has transformed from a muscular uncle with a poisonous tongue and a bit of arrogance to a villain behind the scenes. The effect of connecting the past and the future is fully realized, and he also succeeded in making the uncle who was originally just a passerby instantly stay in the reader's minds. Very impressed. It is precisely because he felt the ferocious control ability of a certain middle-class cartoonist from the comics that the new wife Ag, who has always been highly motivated, admitted defeat frankly in front of his own editor for the first time, showing a side of loss and unwillingness. Because of this kind of layout ability, Eiji Nizuma said that he might be able to master it, but that would have to be a long time in the future. The current new wife Eiji really can't do this. Compared with Yojiro and his new wife Eiji, who comforted each other in shock, Yoshida, after the shock, he started to angrily attack a certain Chennai manga artist. Hey, Chen, you should know where you are serializing, right? After putting down the comic manuscript in his hand, Yoshida took a deep breath and stared at a certain middle-level cartoonist with a gloomy expression. So you should know it without me telling you, let alone serialization, it won't even pass the review, right? Tisk, I just want to show readers a true story. A certain second-level cartoonist was not surprised that the plot of the comic manuscript was rejected by his own editor, or rather, how could a certain second-level cartoonist who had been serializing comics for many years not know the taboos of weekly serialization? Perhaps it was precisely because he wanted to see the gloomy look on his editor-in-chief's face at this moment that a certain middle-class cartoonist deliberately took out the manga manuscript that was obviously not serializable and let Yoshida observe it. Making a cute little loli black, is this what you call reality, Chang? Yoshida suddenly let out a long sigh, stretched out his hand and slapped a certain second-grade cartoonist on the shoulder, and persuaded him earnestly, although the development of the plot is good, but Chang, maybe you, really should find a psychiatrist. But I think the plot of this episode is super interesting. Ignoring Yoshida's increasingly angry expression, a certain middle school cartoonist seemed to have completely immersed himself in his own fantasy world, furiously providing Yoshida with materials for his imagination. The cute little girl, who witnessed her father's death, regarded the people present as the murderer. After years of hard work, she finally caught one of the murderers and killed him crazily. My beloved cat, think about it, don't you think this plot is very inspiring? Let's not talk about inspiration for now, this is not the manga Steins Gate at all, right? Yoshida had a headache and didn't want to think about the plot he had just seen. He slammed the comic manuscript on the table and stared at a certain Chuyunabaku manga artist for a long time, then said in a serious tone, in short, the plot of this episode is absolutely not acceptable. Tisk. My beloved cat, you are really an ordinary person who doesn't understand joy. Faced with Yoshida's unusually serious attitude, a certain Chuyunabaku manga artist confronted him after a moment. He spread his hands helplessly. Okay, I know. This episode can't have a loli turning evil, right? Not only that, evil plots are completely prohibited. Yoshida did not feel complacent because of the surrender of a certain Chuyunabaku manga artist, but added with a little vigilance, other cartoonists draw evil plots just to follow the development of the plot, at least there are some bottom lines, but the evil plots you draw, Cheng, are simply crazy. So even if Steins Gate may be your last comic, I also forbid you to draw any evil-related plots. Tisk, my beloved cat, do you have to be so cruel to deprive me of my pursuit of pleasure? This time, a certain Chuyunabaku manga artist unexpectedly did not use force to vent his dissatisfaction. Well, he used mental attacks instead. My cat, you are a bad guy. I curse you to live the rest of your life as a bad guy. Bad guy? Haha, it doesn't matter. Yoshida was surprised, because Takahashi Makoto actually complained about him as usual. Is this the legendary when a man is about to die, his words are good? The so-called good means having both women and children. In other words, people can only be called good people if they get married and have children. A middle school manga artist didn't care about Yoshida's disdainful smile, and added on his own, so, as a bad guy, you, my cat, are destined to be lonely for the rest of your life. Well, a cat has been urged to get married recently, so it is obvious that a cat is not a good person. By the way, if you are interested in the little loli in the stone gate, please go to the encyclopedia, but a cat will remind you to be mentally prepared first. Good night, dear readers. A middle school cartoonist. Author, MaleProtagonist Mao. Chapter 714. From the birth of life until the soul breaks away from the body and dies, life is always surrounded by various choices. Different from choices, choices usually have a sad or depressing component. After all, if you just choose at that time, it is easy to form a situation of multiple choices, which sounds like a higher degree of freedom. Let the adventure factor hidden deep in the human soul use symbiosis to interfere with human choices for various reasons and excuses. But the choice is different. Once you make up your mind to choose an option, it means you have given up on other options. To put it simply, since it is the path you choose, you have to crawl to the end while crying and kneeling, even if you need to break your head and break your head in the middle. Break through countless barriers. The most typical case of choice is the sentence that was once popular. If I don't have a sword in my hand, I can't protect you. If I keep holding the sword, I can't hold you tight. Are you trying to protect the one you love? Or hug the one you love? Cassius Bright, the delinquent uncle who came from the eight leaves one sword knife wife and daughter style school and holds the title of sword master. His thoughts and feelings before and after the 100 Days War were the most important thing about choices. Good interpretation. When facing the hostile invader, Cassius picked up the sharp blade and commanded the army to resist, because the seemingly bad uncle knew that in front of the powerful enemy, he did not hug his lover at the moment. The only thing you can do is to use your own talents to repel the enemy. However, when Cassius actually resisted the enemy and defeated the invading enemy, he realized that he who had become a national hero would never have the chance to embrace his lover again. Do you regret it? Cassius must have regrets, but he cannot regret it. Without a sword in his hand, Cassius could not protect the country, nor could he protect his beloved wife Lena. Cassius, who chose to take the sword, could not regret it, he could only keep the heartache in his heart. What I want is never to become a national hero, nor to become a rare strategist, I just want to protect Lena. So after the 100 Days War ended, Cassius, who had truly realized his true feelings, began to pursue the belief of guardian, and even gave up his sword and adopted a stick for this belief. Choice is not so much a choice for human beings as it is a certain kind of consciousness that arises after experiencing the baptism of despair and darkness. Just like the content of the latest chapter of the comic Steins Gate. Although the story about a certain lowly's blackening by a certain middle-class cartoonist was decisively rejected by his editor-in-chief Yoshida during the review stage of the manga, however, a certain middle-class cartoonist did not delay the serialization because of this, and instead restarted. I took out a manga manuscript that was enough to serialize one chapter and gave it to the editor-in-chief Yoshida for observation and review. Judging from the joyful smile on the face of a certain middle-class cartoonist, Yoshida immediately realized that the previous comic manuscripts about the plot of Lowly's blackening were definitely taken out by a certain middle-class cartoonist to tease him. However, considering the essential work, Yoshida decided to argue with a certain middle-class cartoonist after reading the newly acquired manga manuscript. By the way, Yoshida did this out of his sense of responsibility as an editor, and definitely not because he was afraid of having a confrontation with a middle-class cartoonist. The plot of this new episode of Steins Gate naturally follows the development of the plot after the counterattack of the bald passerby, which means that the male protagonist Rentaro Okabe is one step closer to evading Mayuri's certain death fate. One step further. According to the setting of the plot and the current development, as long as Rentaro eliminates the first D-male, he can return to the Beta World line and completely solve Mayuri's mortal fate. For the man who witnessed it, for Yoshida, whose protagonist Rentaro made multiple time jumps in order to save Mayuri, this was originally a plot worthy of congratulations. But in the manga, another plot suddenly appeared that made Yoshida grit his teeth, and it was also called a divine twist. When the male protagonist Rentaro Okabe decided to eliminate the first D-male, he suddenly realized something else, about the consequences of the change in the world line caused by the first D-male. If I really carry out such an operation, it will cause another result that I cannot accept, because the consequences of cancelling the first D-male will definitely cause the consequences of the tsundere female assistant Maka's Kurisu. Die. Yes, in the manga Steins Gate, the first D-male was actually sent out when the male protagonist Rentaro witnessed the tsundere female assistant Maka's Kurisu lying in a pool of blood. Sometime after countless time jumps, what Rentaro wants to do is to save Mayuri. Even if there was a risk of mental breakdown or even death along the way, Rentaro never showed any fear or flinch. And in the repeated time jump actions, without the help of the arrogant female assistant Maka's Kurisu to Rentaro, Okabe Rintaro would not have been able to find Mayuri's death in a short period of time. The truth, it is even very likely that he will gradually become numb and have a mental breakdown due to witnessing Mayuri's various deaths too many times. It can be said that both Mayuri and the arrogant female assistant Mako's Kurisu are very important existences to the male protagonist Okabe Rintaro, but now, if Okabe Rintaro chooses to return to the Beta World line, then Mayuri can escape the fate of certain death, but this also means the arrogant female assistant Mako's Kurisu will inevitably be assassinated. If you want to save Mayuri, you will inevitably sacrifice the tsundere female assistant Mako's Kurisu. If you want to save the tsundere female assistant Mako's Kurisu, you will inevitably let Mayuri fall into the fate of certain death. For the male protagonist Rintaro Okabe, who has fought against fate countless times, what he has to make now is not a choice, but a choice. HN, the plot of your story. After putting down the manga manuscript, Yoshida stared at a middle-level cartoonist with an ugly face. Does it have to be drawn like this? Why must Mayuri and Kurisu die? Woolen cloth. My beloved cat, you really asked a stupid question, a middle-grade cartoonist who was exchanging text messages with someone on his mobile phone replied without looking up, because this is fate. The choice of Stonegate. It's either the lowly being black, or this kind of depressing plot. Although he didn't say anything about the bad taste of a certain middle-class cartoonist, Yoshida could also feel it from the cartoon manuscript. Chen, you are really. Speaking of my beloved cat, if it were you, who would you choose? The naturally stupid Mayuri or the arrogant assistant? A certain middle school cartoonist suddenly raised his head and asked seriously, by the way, in one sentence, your answer to my beloved cat will determine the subsequent plot development of the comic. Whether it is Mayuri or Kurisu, there is no shortage of supporters among readers, so if a middle-level cartoonist draws the plot of the next comic based on his own choice, and at the same time explains to readers that this is the choice of his own editor, the result can be imagined. Of course I am. Chen, are you plotting against me? Yoshida, who was about to answer just now, suddenly realized that he had almost been tricked by a middle-class cartoonist, so he immediately complained dissatisfiedly. Why can't we only make such a depressing choice? Why can't we come up with a way to get the best of both worlds and choose to keep both people alive? My familiar cat, your idea is very good. After a certain second-level cartoonist nodded in agreement with Yoshida's proposal, he picked up his phone and edited the text message while sighing. So, for Lyozu regarding the problem, I think the best of both worlds is a very good choice. Ruko. Cartoonist, Shizugawa. Yoshida also felt something was wrong when he felt something was wrong about a middle-class cartoonist who suddenly changed the topic. Wait. Chen, are we talking about the plot of the comic Steins Gate now? That is to say, both people accept it? This is the suggestion from my beloved cat, above. Send. After sending the message, a certain middle-class cartoonist looked up and saw an unnatural look on his face. Yoshida, who was at his extreme point, was staring at him. He couldn't help but spread his hands helplessly, and sighed with a sigh, yes, my beloved is a cat. Of course we are discussing the plot of the manga Steins Gate. It's just that I feel that the problem Ryuko is facing at this moment seems to be the same as Rintaro in the manga. It is a major event that can be called life choice. What problems did Jinghehe encounter? Yoshida said that it was not because he was curious, but he wanted to understand better. The two female assistants confessed their love to Ryuko at the same time. Ryuko is troubled by this. A certain middle-class cartoonist ignored the information he had just revealed and just sighed alone about the damage caused by the single Yoshida. Tisk, I didn't expect that the assistant who was so irritated back then, would be such a sinful man. By the way, is this related to the plot of the manga Steins Gate? Yoshida felt that a certain middle-class cartoonist was deliberately changing the topic, so he raised such a question. My familiar cat, Don't you think Misao Ueno's character is somewhat similar to that of Maka's Kurisu? A certain middle-class manga artist squinted his eyes and showed a joyful smile, and asked Yoshida friend's tip said, especially in terms of the cute attribute tsundere. In that case. After recalling the memory of his previous contact with Misao Ueno, Yoshida nodded seemingly in agreement. As for Mayuri. A certain second-level cartoonist paused for a moment, then continued to add, my familiar cat, do you know the character of Mayuri in the manga Steins Gate, is actually it comes from that cute assistant. Wait, after Yoshida hesitated for a moment, he finally recalled something that he had almost ignored. So that means, the message you just sent to Jinghe River, Cheng. Well, Lyoza is a little overwhelmed by the confessions of the two assistants, so I told Lyoza not to make any choice, but to choose to accept the confessions of both of them. A middle-class cartoonist raised his mobile phone to Yoshida. He waved as a sign, and then continued with full of pleasure, and I also told Lyoza that the person who made the suggestion, is actually my favorite cat, you. By the way, if Ryoko is arrested for bigamy in the future. A certain Chuyonibu cartoonist squinted his eyes and stared at Yoshida. After looking him up and down, he said in a gloating tone, my cat, you are an instigator. A certain cat is going crazy. 2 meetings, 2 meeting minutes, 2 meeting minutes, and 2 briefings must be written respectively, and the contents cannot be completely the same. The recording of the meeting is a full 4 hours, and a certain cat has been listening to it over and over again these days. Ah, it's going crazy meow. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. A middle school cartoonist. Author, Mao Do SD Mao. Chapter 715. The D-mail so far has been cancelled, and the world line has been returned to its original state. That is, a world line in which the dystopia dominated by CERN will not appear, and a world line in which Mayuri will not die. Then, on that world line, Maka's Kurisu will die. This is the inner monologue of the male protagonist Rintaro Okabe in the comic Steins Gate. It is also the key dialogue at the end of the previous chapter of the comic when a middle-class cartoonist repeated his old trick of stuck plot. But for Yoshida who has observed the manga manuscript in advance, and for readers who have observed the serialized manga after the weekly release, this is the rhythm that means the beginning of the depressing plot of a certain Demon King cartoonist. After all, ever since the divine twist plot of the comic Steins Gate, the pace of the entire comic has suddenly increased rapidly, and the relaxing routine that could have soothed readers' nerves has been cut in half. The serial plot of the comic is completely centered around with the core operation of changing the world line to save Mayuri. For many readers, while observing the comics, they almost also witnessed the struggle of the male protagonist Rintaro Okabe. In other words, they witnessed the growth of Rintaro Okabe and the price he paid for his growth. At the beginning, that is, the time when Mayuri died for the first time, Rintaro was at a loss and panicked. Later, whether it was escaping with Mayuri in various ways, fighting the enemy, or using time jump to go back to the past, the purpose that Rintaro wanted to achieve with all his actions was just to think about it. Save Mayuri. However, in the process of saving Mayuri, Rintaro, who was originally full of arrogance, could no longer claim to be the arrogant mad scientist Phoenix Academy Murama as before. It can even be said that Rintaro gave up the arrogance he used to wear. The skin on the body. Because after Rintaro failed several times to save Mayuri, he found that he could not let Mayuri live no matter what, and could only watch Mayuri die in front of him over and over again. It was at that moment that Okaben Rintaro truly realized that he was not a crazy scientist, but just an ordinary person who was completely helpless in the face of cruel reality. In the comics, in order to reverse the fate of Mayuri's death, Rintaro almost tried his best. This also made readers who have always been observers nervous. Fortunately, Rentaro finally figured out a way to save Mayuri's life, although judging from the serialized plot, the whole process was full of helplessness and depression. With the withdrawal of the D-mails that had been sent, Mayuri gradually began to get rid of the fate of mortality, and in returning to the previous world line, although there were more or less the memories after changing the world line, but the people who used D-mail are still the same people. The only difference is, Rintaro Okabe, who has experienced many time jumps, is no longer the arrogant mad scientist of the Phoenix Institute. But most readers don't have the time to pay attention to these. Because judging from the content of the comic serial plot, Mayuri has been able to escape the fate of mortal death. This also means that Okabe Rintaro's obsession can finally dissipate, and readers' expectations can finally be answered. At least, in this chapter of the comic, before Rentaro said the inner monologue, many readers who observed the comic series thought so. But after reading the last chapter of the manga, and seeing Rintaro suddenly turning gloomy and uttering his inner monologue after Maka's Kurasu's joking reminder, I originally thought Mayuri was finally saved and breathed a sigh of relief. Readers, once again recall the tension and worry when being dominated by the sudden divine twist plot. In order to save Mayuri, whether he performs time jumps again and again, or sacrifices the wishes of his friends around him, it can be said that Rintaro has paid too much, and he has been burdened with too much. But if you want to save Mayuri, you are destined to sacrifice Maka's Kurasu, the arrogant assistant who accompanies Rintaro all the way and helps Rintaro find the opportunity to save Mayuri. This is for Rintaro. It is simply an impossible option to accept. What good is an angry mad scientist? What's the use of fighting the whole world? You can't even save the people you want to save, so what's the use of going back to the past? Faced with the choice of Mayuri and Maka's Kurasu can only save one person, the male protagonist Rintaro Okabe did not show a resolute and courageous side like other comic male protagonists, but instead had the idea of escape. Rintaro didn't know how to face it, or rather, didn't know how to choose. After this chapter of the manga was serialized, almost all readers who followed the manga Steins Gate were discussing how to solve this dilemma. Of course, Mayuri or Maka's Kurasu also have their own supporters, therefore, there are also readers who hope that Rintaro will eventually choose to sacrifice another person to save their favorite character. Not only on the reader's side, but also on the editor's side, there are many responsible editors discussing the subsequent plot development of the comic Steins Gate. Although I should be very happy to be able to receive enough manga manuscripts to last 2 issues of the series when I receive them. Yoshida didn't look happy at all, but stared at him with hateful eyes. A certain second-grade cartoonist said angrily, "But Cheng, have you ever thought about it? If you serialize such a plot, you will definitely be criticized by readers." "Oh? Really? Are you sure you can achieve such an effect with my cat?" A certain second-grade cartoonist opened his eyes to his own editor with a look full of expectations. He rarely spoke to ridicule and complained, but instead asked with great interest. He said, "In fact, I just want to give the two of you an equal opportunity to compete." "What about equal opportunities for competition, Cheng? Your intention in drawing like this is actually to deceive the readers, right?" Yoshida, who had already seen through the truth, dismissed the words of a middle-class cartoonist. First of all, the serialization the plot of Mayuri and Rintaro's bond, and then immediately released the content of the episode of Maka's Kurasu and Rintaro's bond. This is clearly interfering with readers' judgment. What's the interference? It doesn't exist. A certain middle-level cartoonist spread his hands helplessly, staring at Okabe Rintaro's character on the table and said, "Since both sides have their own advantages, then what I can do is to, before Rintaro makes the final choice, give everyone a chance to say it. Then after these 2 chapters are serialized, what will be the final direction of the plot?" Yoshida, who had just finished speaking, saw that a certain second-level cartoonist was preparing to complain about him and immediately responded without hesitation. He opened his mouth and continued to add, "Of course, I don't want Cheng to give spoilers. I just want to ask you, How will the plot end in the end? Will everyone be happy or depressed? Compared with this, I'm more curious about the final outcome of Lyoz's side. After a certain second-grade cartoonist lowered his head and pondered for a long time, he suddenly started talking about unrelated things. But judging from the information I have, I estimate that Miss Aoi Ueno has little chance of winning. Hey, Chen, don't change the topic suddenly, huh? In other words, Yoshida originally wanted to scold a certain middle school cartoonist for his crooked behavior, but he suddenly remembered that a certain middle school cartoonist had done something wrong before. The cartoonist communicated with Shizukawa in order to trap him, then Yoshida's heartbeat suddenly accelerated and asked with some uncertainty, in the end, will Rintaro choose to save Mayuri at the expense of his tsundere assistant Maka's Kurisu? It seems that in order to predict the plot in advance, Yoshida also worked hard, at least in this moment of imaginative thinking. He did not forget to set up a trap for a certain second-rate cartoonist. This is not what I said, but your own guess, my beloved cat. Do you think I will answer you with this seems to be no spoiler but is actually a spoiler answer? Facing the face in the trap of the unscrupulous editor Yoshida, a certain middle-grade cartoonist raised his index finger and shook it, with a disdainful smile on his face. Compared to before Rintaro was finally chosen, my beloved cat, let's finish serializing the plots of these 2 episodes first. Hey, Chen, you guy, are you too vigilant? Yoshida, whose intention was exposed, did not feel embarrassed at all. Instead, after making a complaint, he asked with some confusion, but Chen, this is the first time I heard you urge me to do serialization work. Because I'm really looking forward to the effect of these 2 chapters after they are serialized. A certain second-grade cartoonist heard this, with a joyful smile on his face. For readers who don't know the subsequent development of the plot, the true meaning of separation is the emotional line between Ri and Kurisu Makas, will definitely make the depressive effect of the entire manga outstanding, even beyond the sky. The plot of the original comic Steins Gate has already made readers feel embarrassed. And now, if the emotional lines of Mayuri, Kurisu Makas, and Rintaro Okabe are added one after the other, then for readers who don't know how to choose in the first place, it will be almost the same. You will directly increase the selected difficulty from nightmare level to hell level. Is this a rhythm that a certain middle-level cartoonist is going to drive readers crazy? Chen, you will never die a happy death. The editor-in-chief of a certain weekly magazine stopped thinking, and then cursed with a chill. A middle school cartoonist. Author, Mao Do Sde Mao. Chapter 716. Thinking back to the letters from readers and the phone calls that kept his editorial colleagues busy, Yoshida sighed again. It's been a long time since I've seen this kind of scene. He then fled with the excuse that I want to discuss the subsequent plot of the manga with the manga artist Hao Winkuma, leaving his miserable editorial colleagues to face the brutal attack of the reader army with a bitter face. The cause of the incident was that the plot of Mayuri and Okabe Rintaro's bond was serialized in this episode of the manga Steins Gate. After reading the content of this episode, many readers began to support the protagonist Okabe Rintaro and chose to give up his tsundere female assistant to save Mayuri because of the influence of the plot. Childhood sweethearts, this kind of pure love, to be honest, for humans who always accidentally indulge in memories, the lethality is quite strong. If readers knew the content of the next chapter, the situation would definitely be reversed again. But unfortunately, according to the comic manuscript that Yoshida observed in advance by taking advantage of his position as the editor-in-chief, once the plot of the next chapter of the comic Steins Gate is serialized, then, the support rate of the arrogant female assistant Maka's Kurisu will definitely increase significantly, and she may even be able to counterattack. But such a plot makes Yoshida very worried. There is no problem in using the plot to elevate the status of the 2 female characters. Whether it is Maka's Kurisu or Mayuri, the content of these 2 chapters will leave a deep impression in the readers' minds. From the perspective of the weekly editor-in-chief, This choice is definitely the most favorite and most desired scene for the weekly. But if you look at it from the perspective of the cartoonist's editor-in-chief, the effect of these two chapters of the plot of a certain Chuyuni cartoonist, is simply courting death. After all, judging from the current serialization of the manga Steins Gate, whether to save Mayuri and sacrifice Maka's Kurisu, or choose Maka's Kurisu and give up saving Mayuri, the male protagonist Okabe Rentaro must make a choice. Even if the final result is unbearable for the readers, it is better than letting the plot drag on and destroy the rhythm of the entire manga. Yes, since the manga Steins Gate started with that god-turn plot, the rhythm of the entire manga has become more compact. Even if there are many daily plots interspersed in the middle, Yoshida can still create a sense of time pressure from the words and deeds of the male protagonist. So Yoshida will be sure that after the serialization of Mayuri and Maka's Kurisu's bond plot with Okabe Rentaro, the content of the next episode will be the moment when the male protagonist Okabe Rentaro makes a choice. So, is this the choice of Steins Gate? Yoshida, who was heading towards the base of a certain Chuyunibu manga artist, was always thinking about the true meaning of Steins Gate's choice. What exactly was it hinting at? What? That guy Aiken is not at home. However, unfortunately, a certain Chuyunibu manga artist who had been staying at home to finish his manga recently was not at home today. Sorry, Yoshida-san, Rina smiled apologetically. With a helpless look on her face, Makoto-kun was taken away by Officer Utsumi. Officer Utsumi, Yoshida suddenly felt his heart skip a beat, and his expression became serious involuntarily. Did Makoto say something like, "How dare you break into the murderer's territory alone?" that would cause misunderstandings? That's not it. Thinking of her husband's crazy and second-year personality, Rina smiled awkwardly. Makoto-kun was just asked to assist in the investigation of the case. Huh? Assist in the investigation of the case? Yoshida was surprised, looking at Rina with a look of "Are you kidding me?" and after hesitating for a while, he asked as if to confirm, did I hear it wrong just now? How could Makoto be invited to assist in the investigation of the case? Hey, Yoshida-kun, you complain about Takahashi Makoto in front of Rina like this, are you really a man? Just as Rina was about to tell Yoshida what happened, a certain Chuyunibaku manga artist called. "My beloved cat, if you want to find me, come to the police station." The Chuyunibaku manga artist on the other end of the phone paused for a moment, and then continued to speak to Yoshida's surprise. "By the way, you should have known my whereabouts from Rina. Now I can tell you that with the help of Detective Hao Winkuma, a superpower murder case using time rewind was solved." Yoshida suddenly felt a little stuffy in his chest. Is it because the alpaca in his heart was stimulated and waving a wave punch? "Takahashi Makoto, please don't disclose the case to irrelevant people at will." Before Yoshida could say anything, a woman's voice came from the other end of the phone to stop him. "Tisk. Stingy. If it weren't for the professor and I working together, you are sure you can solve the case in such a short time?" The complaint of a certain Chuyunibaku manga artist had just fallen, and Yoshida heard something incredible coming from the other end of the phone. "Huh, you actually want to snatch my phone? Hola hola hola, when it comes to physical skills, I admit that I am only inferior to Emperor Kai, who almost kicked out the finale. You want to defeat me? Hee hee, first give up your obsession with your human identity, ha 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 ha." Yoshida looked at Rina, who was covering her mouth and snickering next to her, and hung up the phone decisively with a gloomy expression. When Yoshida rushed to the police station as soon as possible according to the prompts of a certain middle-grade cartoonist, he saw a certain middle-grade cartoonist standing there with a thoughtful look on his face. I can't understand why a certain middle-class cartoonist who was very pleasantly teasing a female police officer just now suddenly became so deep at this moment, but Yoshida's intuition is roaring and wailing, reminding him not to approach a certain middle-class cartoonist rashly. Well, absolutely not. That's Seeing another handsome middle-aged man not far away who also seemed to be thinking about life, Yoshida vaguely remembered that the other man seemed to be the professor mentioned by a certain middle school cartoonist. He didn't dare Yoshida, who rashly approached a certain second-year manga artist, immediately brightened up and quickly came to Professor Yukawa Manabu and whispered, "I'm sorry, Professor Yukawa Manabu, that guy Cheng is causing trouble for you." "I don't know you." Professor Yukawa Manabu was not angry because his thoughts were interrupted. After observing Yoshida with squinted eyes for a long time, he silently shook his head. "You are." "I am the editor-in-chief of the weekly Shounen Jump." Just as Yoshida was about to introduce himself, he was suddenly pulled away from Professor Yukawa Manabu by a huge force. "Professor, this is my servant, my familiar cat." After greeting Professor Yukawa Manabu without looking back, a certain middle school cartoonist grabbed Yoshida's collar and ran outside, while also he did not forget to say loudly, "Professor, because of what happened just now, I suddenly had a bold idea. In short, organization will leave it to you." "Hey, Cheng. This guy, wait for a moment." Yoshida's screams gradually became lower as the middle-class cartoonist went away. The second-grade cartoonist and Frankenstein. Ms. Utsumi, who was too late to stop a certain middle-grade cartoonist from leaving, snorted dissatisfiedly, "This combination can actually, tisk, the world of weirdos is really incomprehensible." So. Yoshida, who was a little out of breath, looked at a certain middle-level cartoonist who finally stopped, and couldn't help but ask, "What exactly did you go through just now, Cheng? What's going on with helping to solve the case?" "I don't know. While you are a cartoonist, you also have a part-time job as a detective. Those are not important. What's important is, I just witnessed a great love." Looking at Yoshida's more curious look, a certain middle school cartoonist immediately waved his hand dissatisfied, dragging Yoshida to stop a car taxi. "Anyway, I don't have time to explain. My beloved cat, hurry up and get in the car." Wait. No, wait. My motorcycle is still parked at the police station, Hunden. X suspects the dedication, although a great love is not advocated, but it truly shows the secret admirer is contemptuous to the fullest. Well, this is not a recommendation, but a certain cat suddenly felt that the plot between the assistant and Mayuri before Kuma made his choice was really great. A middle school cartoonist. Author, Mao Do Sde Mao. Chapter 717. Humans may recognize Chuyunibu more from words than from actions. For example, standing in front of the subway elevator door, stretching out your hand and making an action similar to using your mind to make the door open automatically. If you just make such a gesture, others may only think that this guy wants to do this once on a whim, and at most it will only cause others to laugh, ahem, a good-natured laugh. But if you make a gesture and add a crazy Chuyunibu speech like "Your door leads to hell, summon the guardian of the kingdom of the dead in my name," then you will definitely be directly judged as Chuyunibu, and according to the content of the speech, you can also test the degree of Chuyunibu in detail. However, most Chuyunibu patients are not severe or terminal, but just hover between mild and middle stages. The reason for this is that most Chuyunibu patients do not have a perfect setting for themselves, or in other words, there will be a setting without a fixed routine, such as Holy Sword Magician today and Black Flame User tomorrow. But in the manga Steins Gate, the protagonist Okabe Rentaro is a real patient with severe Chuyunibu. The reason why he is called severe is mainly because Okabe Rentaro has a set of settings for various unrealistic delusions. Okabe Rentaro gave himself the character of crazy mad scientist Hounankuma. He conducted experimental research on time machines and future props in order to control the world by controlling time travel. According to the routine of classic novels, Okabe Rentaro, who believes that the whole world revolves around himself and is immersed in his own fictional world, naturally has to set up powerful enemies for himself, so organization or CERN, this enemy setting that is so huge that it is impossible for Okabe Rentaro to compete, is quite in line with Okabe Rentero's standards. After all, it seems more interesting to conquer the strong than to bully the weak. But what really makes the manga Steins Gate interesting is Okabe Rentero's second-year setting. No, to be precise, it should be a series of things that happened in reality in response to Okabe Rentero's various second-year settings. It is precisely because of the setting of crazy mad scientist Hao Winkuma that a machine that can interfere with time that only exists in the concept can be created with the help of an assistant. And from the plot in the middle of the manga Steins Gate, Okabe Rentero knew that once the machine was used to send D-mail, it would affect the whole world due to the butterfly effect, but Okabe Rentero did not mean to stop it at all, but let the members of the laboratory use it unscrupulously. Aren't the above behaviors in line with Okabe Rentero's setting of himself as crazy mad scientist Hao Winkuma? Not every Chuyunibu can save the world, but most of those who save the world have Chuyunibu. This is the origin of Chuyunibu save the world, right? So in the plot of the Amanon Suzuha chapter of the manga Steins Gate, the development of the plot really made Okabe Rentero realize his previous delusion. He became the enemy of the world's largest organization, and also became a hero who saved the world. Therefore, according to this plot routine, that is, the logic that Okabe Rentero's words will eventually become a reality, it can be inferred that the plan of Operation Goddess in charge of the present that appeared in the manga Steins Gate will appear in the later plots. This is the conclusion drawn by Yoshida, the editor-in-chief of a certain weekly magazine, after repeatedly observing several previously serialized comics and sincerely asking Eiji Niizuma. With the friendly reminder of Niizuma Eiji, Yoshida understood how the various routines in the manga Steins Gate unfolded. However, Yoshida originally thought that the plot related to Operation Goddess in charge of the present would appear after the plot of Bonus between Makas Kurisu and Rentero ended, but he never expected that a certain Chuyuni cartoonist would actually release this killer move in advance in the plot of Bonus between Makas Kurisu and Rentero. In the comic manuscript about Bonus between Makas Kurisu and Rentero, Makas Kurisu, the arrogant assistant, finally understood why Rentero, who was always full of rage, was reluctant to take action when he was about to complete the last step, because if you want to save Mayuri, you must delete the original D-mail, the one that changed the D-mail that had been killed. This also means that if you want Mayuri to escape the fate of death, you must return to the world line where Makas Kurisu was killed. The main content of this comic is actually how Makas Kurisu encourages Rentero to make a choice, to give up himself to save Mayuri. Of course, for Yoshida and the readers, the arrogant assistant Makas Kurisu confessed her feelings to Rentero, which can be regarded as an Easter egg of a certain Chuyunibaku manga artist's conscience in the sad and depressing plot. Now we are entering the final stage of Operation Goddess in charge of the present. The moment of victory has arrived, and we will not succumb to any conspiracy. We will carry out our beliefs, and finally fight to the end in the final holy war. For this victory, I salute my comrades who have become my brothers and sisters and fought for me. I thank all the thoughts that have been sacrificed. In the end, I will usher in the world I expect, and everything is the choice of Steins Gate. The world will be rebuilt. Kurisu, I'm sorry. When Rentero decided to give up Makas Kurisu and choose Mayuri, the same old declaration of Chuyunibari made people realize that the world is the same as the previous one. Yoshida, who was observing the comics, could no longer feel embarrassed as usual, nor could he laugh as usual. Inexplicable sadness, along with the hoarse shouting of Rentero in the comics, made depression spread in his heart. In the end, although he arrived at the most critical moment, the Chuyunibaku manga artist was so crazy that he didn't have time to let Makas Kurisu, the proud assistant, express his feelings frankly, because at the most critical moment, the original D-mail that changed the world line and caused many tragedies was still deleted. Back to the original world line. At this moment, the outcome of the final holy war has been revealed. The crazy mad scientist Hounan Kuma, faced all the attacks from organizations and CERN, and finally achieved complete victory by manipulating time and space. Finally saved Mayuri. The world's ruling structure has been rewritten. What awaits us must be the chaotic future. But the arrogant assistant and Maka's Kurisu were sacrificed. This is the choice of Steins Gate. In the changed world line, Rintaro once again issued the same middle school declaration as usual, but this time, everything Rintaro said was not the system setting of the previous self-contained style, but the real facts. It's the same old Shuyuni dialogue, but why? Yoshida put down the comic manuscript and fell into deep thought for a long time. Then he asked a Shuyuni cartoonist with a depressed look, "Why do I feel a little uncomfortable now? I can't even laugh at all. My beloved cat, don't you understand?" After sighing silently, a Shuyuni cartoonist squinted his eyes and said with emotion, "Just like what I experienced before, you also witnessed a great love." This is completely different. Yoshida suddenly felt that a Shuyuni cartoonist seemed to have mastered the two skills of atmosphere killer and talk to death to the master level. No, it's the same. The cry of despair. A certain Shuyuni cartoonist refuted with a serious look, the crying of Uncle Ishigami that day seemed to vomit out his soul, and the Shuyuni scream of Rentaro in the comics that made the soul tremble. Although the performance is different, the feelings they want to express are absolutely the same. Sorry, readers, because of the heavy rain, a certain cat has been stationed at the construction site these days and has not been able to update in time. I am very sorry. I won't explain too much. In short, it is a certain cat's fault for not updating and explaining in time. I am very sorry. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. A middle school cartoonist. Author, MaleProtagonist. Chapter 718. Looking blankly at the blank comic manuscript in front of him, a certain middle school cartoonist did not write as fast as usual, but kept sitting like this for a whole hour. Of course, halfway through, a certain middle school cartoonist once raised his hand and wanted to draw something on the manuscript paper, but every time when the brush was about to touch the comic manuscript paper, the certain middle school cartoonist suddenly stopped. The certain middle school cartoonist who repeated this behavior several times did not realize that everything he had just done could definitely drive patients with obsessive-compulsive disorder to death. If it were an ordinary cartoonist, he might not be unfamiliar with this behavior. That's right, the state of a certain middle school cartoonist at this moment is very similar to that of a novel comic author who is in the Kavanka plot state. But unfortunately, a certain middle school cartoonist is not an ordinary cartoonist, but a time traveler with a plug-in. Google searched can. So Kavanka plots and the like will not appear for a certain middle school cartoonist. It is absolutely impossible to appear in this life. As a time traveler, others can achieve success and reach the pinnacle of life with a clear conscience under the banner of presenting the original world comics to this world. But why do I feel endless emptiness when I achieve various achievements? A certain Chuyunabaku manga artist, who pinched his chin and pondered for a moment, began to complain about himself because of the unrelieved emotions in his heart. Is it because of the influence of Haoerhoin Kuma in the comic Steins Gate, or am I just very hypocritical? If Yoshida, the editor-in-chief of a certain weekly magazine, was present, he would definitely be surprised by the remarks of a certain Chuyunabaku manga artist. Well, he would definitely be so surprised that he would forget to complain and ridicule. Unfortunately, because he vaguely sensed that the little sea otter was about to suspend publication and escape again, Yoshida, the editor-in-chief of a certain weekly magazine, recently ordered a batch of expensive tracking equipment to track the little sea otter 24 hours a day. I have to say that it is a pity that Yoshida was not present. Should I start a new plot from this episode? Or should I follow the original plan and let the manga enter the world line of Steins Gate and serialize it all the way to the end? A certain Chuyunabaku manga artist who was worried about the direction of the next plot of the manga Steins Gate was shaking his body while his brain was working fast to calculate, whether it is the editorial side of my cat or the cartoonist side of the Black Flame King, they will surely let me continue to draw. Tisk, they are all a bunch of selfish guys. If they knew that the plot of the manga Steins Gate could be derived from the content of the previous episode, the weekly editorial department would definitely let Yoshida persuade the Chuyunabaku manga artist to continue serializing for the sake of profit. Even the serious editor-in-chief of Pingza might personally participate in the persuasion. The same is true for the cartoonist. Although Eiji Nizuma has admitted that the two comics he is currently serializing have lost, this is only a temporary state. With Eiji Nizuma's high morale, he will definitely not be defeated from now on. Therefore, if a certain Chuyuni cartoonist can continue serializing, Eiji Nizuma will definitely join the persuasion army. The same reason, Yashiro Mumanji's good friends, the silver-haired guy Fukuda, and even Jinghe River, who claims to be a disciple of a certain Chuyuni cartoonist, whether it is out of the desire to defeat competitors or to gain recognition, they will also persuade a certain Chuyuni cartoonist to continue serializing. The only one who will support a certain Chuyuni cartoonist to finish serializing as soon as possible is probably the little otter who tries every means to avoid serialization, right? So, continue, considering the division of the camps between the editor and the cartoonist, a certain Chuyuni cartoonist fell into a state of entanglement. But this is only temporary. When his eyes subconsciously swept across the table, a certain Chuyuni cartoonist immediately had a solution. The front side will continue the new plot, and the back side will end as planned. Gently turning the coin in his hand, a certain Chuanibiao cartoonist took a deep breath, flicked it up with his thumb, and then immediately clasped his hands in front of his chest, staring at the coin that had begun to fall. Is this the choice of Steins Gate? Looking at the coin standing upright on the floor, the Chuanibiao cartoonist did not think of starting over again, but sighed deeply, walked to the window and looked at the sky in the distance, and whispered as if talking to himself, "So that's it? Spyo, this is your answer to me." Whether to cut into the plot of Steins Gate 0 is indeed a difficult problem for a certain Chuanibiao cartoonist. According to the original plot development of Steins Gate, if Mayuri's first death is the turning point of the plot that opens the entire work, then in the end, the plot of Rentaro arriving at another world line to save Maka's Kurasuke pushes this work to another height. To put it simply, if Mayuri's first death is considered the beginning of the story of the manga Steins Gate, then the plot when Rentaro recovers from his decadent state and involves time jumping again to save Maka's Kurasuke should be the true beginning of the story of the manga Steins Gate. But the problem is that in a parallel world line, after experiencing countless tortures of Mayuri's world line convergence death, Rentaro did not withdraw from the decadent state, but accepted the death of the arrogant assistant and gave up the idea of saving Maka's Kurasuke. No, it was not just the idea of saving the assistant that he gave up, but also the Chuyuni character that Rentaro had always insisted on. Although from the perspective of serialization effect, cutting into this part of the plot can make readers feel depressed and make a certain Chuyuni cartoonist gain a lot of pleasure, however, let alone Yoshida, the editor-in-chief of Guardian Dog on the editorial side, even a certain Chuyuni cartoonist himself can't make up his mind to serialize. And what makes a certain Chuyuni cartoonist hesitate is the rhythm of the whole comic. Okabe Rentaro has changed from a wild and unbridled Chuyuni scientist to a timid and mediocre college student who is no longer willing to mention his dark history. This strong contrast may disrupt the overall rhythm of the manga Steins Gate and ruin this work that is now suppressing the cartoonist side in all aspects. So, the long-lost confusion reappeared on a certain Chuyuni cartoonist. "My destiny's spy, will you die if I give you a little hint?" The Chuyuni cartoonist, who was angry because of the confusion, clenched his hands and couldn't help but look up and shout at the sky, whether it's a comic character or a small person in the pen, puppets and dolls, they also have human rights, you bastard. A middle school cartoonist. Author, Mao Do Sde Mao. Chapter 719. Regarding the ending of the previous chapter of the manga Steins Gate, Yoshida can be said to be full of resentment. Although in the end, with the encouragement of his arrogant assistant Maka's Kurisu, the male protagonist Rentaro Okabe chose to save Mayuri, but the soul-trembling Chiyuni monologue made Yoshida feel deeply depressed. At the same time, I couldn't help but have a trace of fantasy. Since the male protagonist Rentaro Okabe can change the fate of certain death and save Mayuri, then, can he also use a similar method to complete the seemingly impossible task of rescuing the proud assistant Kurisu? Mission: evoke miracles. It was because of this expectation that Yoshida waited patiently for 3 days and then came to the base of a certain middle-class cartoonist. The reason why Yoshida chose to wait for 3 days before coming to the door was naturally calculated based on the speed at which a certain second-grade cartoonist usually completes the comic draft. You know, whether it is a certain second-grade cartoonist, it can be called super speed level in the industry. As for his drawing ability and his behavior of never delaying a draft, Yoshida, as the editor-in-chief of a second-grade cartoonist, has always been quite satisfied with this. But this time... Huh? Cheng, you haven't finished the drawing yet. Yoshida, the editor-in-chief of a weekly magazine, expressed his shock when he heard for the first time that a second-year cartoonist failed to complete the cartoon draft in time. Hey, Cheng, is it that the painting is not finished, or, by the way, please don't tell me, the content of the last chapter is the final chapter, and the comic Steins Gate ends like this? Hey, my beloved cat, if the manga Steins Gate ends like that. Although a certain middle-class cartoonist has no such idea, but, why is he teasing his own editor in order to gain pleasure? Yes, a certain middle-level cartoonist said this is possible. Use this sad and depressing ending as the final chapter of the comic Steins Gate, and also as the final performance of Cheng's career as a cartoonist. Tisk. Yoshida squinted and stared at a middle-class cartoonist. After a long time, he spoke quietly to comfort, although as the editor-in-charge, I should not interfere with Aiken's creation of comics, but if Aiken, you really regard this ending as the final performance of comics and your comic career, I always feel that Cheng, you will be beaten by readers in the future. Absolutely. My beloved cat, are you consoling, or threatening? A certain second-grade cartoonist put on an innocent look and spread his hands indifferently towards Yoshida, who stipulates that the ending of comics cannot be based on did it end in a tragic and depressing way. It's not that it's not allowed, it's just that it's not a good idea to do so. Instead of rushing to comfort a middle-class cartoonist, Yoshida, the editor-in-chief of the weekly magazine, just adopted a more roundabout persuasion strategy. Do you still remember what editor-in-chief Sasaki said? As long as comics are interesting. And for most people, the so-called interesting comics mean. Oh? Is it interesting? A certain second-level cartoonist squinted his eyes. Hearing this, a malicious smile appeared on his face. He interrupted Yoshida's unfinished words and asked, speaking of my favorite cat, oh, why do you think that the so-called tragic endings such as sadness and depression are not the endings that interesting comics should have? Compared to sad endings, usually happy endings are more likely to make viewers feel happy and interesting, right? In response to the rebuttal of a middle-class cartoonist, Yoshida looked at him with contempt. No need to say more? It's just common sense, right? Common sense? But for me, this kind of depressive ending full of darkness is what I really find interesting, a certain middle school cartoonist said with a smile, which was disgusting. Han said, especially every time I see readers immersed in comics, their spirits and emotions fluctuate with the development of the comic plot, I feel that this kind of addictive control ability is quite pleasant. Now I finally know why I had such a strong sense of déjà vu when I saw Father Kotomine in the manga Fate. Yoshida stared at a middle-class manga artist and complained angrily, essentially, say, Kotomine Kaire's character was basically drawn by Makoto based on himself. Speaking of father, a certain middle school cartoonist didn't know what interesting thing he thought of. He found a small notebook from the drawer and handed it to Yoshida with a joyful smile. "My dependent cat, let me show you something interesting. This is, Taking the small notebook from the hands of a certain middle-grade cartoonist, Yoshida just glanced at it and fell into a state of speechlessness. Under the playful eyes of a certain middle-grade cartoonist, a certain weekly, the editor in charge silently closed the small notebook in his hand, and then said with despair, "Qualification certificate, this is unbelievable. Someone like you, Chen, can actually be a priest. Hey, my beloved cat, do you want to be like me, join the organization of Thulhu?" Shaking the small notebook in his hand, a middle-grade cartoonist said to Yoshida with a smile, "I can be your guide." "I don't want to join." Wait a minute. Thinking back to the little notebook he just saw, Yoshida suddenly reacted, "By the way, what is the Society of Thulhu? Also, Chen, the little notebook in your hand. Hey, my beloved cat, the gossiping and joking are over here." A certain second-grade cartoonist quickly stuffed the small notebook in his hand back into the drawer and locked it, then put on a serious look and suggested to Yoshida with a serious face, "Now, let's talk about the subsequent plot development of the comic Steins Gate. Speaking of which, Chen, are you trying to change the subject on purpose?" In response to Yoshida's complaints, a certain middle-class cartoonist ignored it. Seeing that Yoshida was still planning to continue the topic, a certain middle-class cartoonist took out a thick stack of comic manuscripts from the drawer and placed it in front of Yoshida. "This is the manuscript for the next chapter." After flipping through a few pages, Yoshida showed a sad expression on his face. "Hey, Chen, didn't you say you haven't finished the drawing yet?" "My beloved cat, obviously, what I just said is all lies to you," a certain second-grade cartoonist said calmly. The editor-in-chief of a certain weekly said that he now really wants to slap the guy in front of him. "My beloved cat, do you understand the reason why I did this?" A certain secondary cartoonist once again ignored Yoshida's angry little eyes, put on an expression of "I am doing this for your own good," and shook his head with regret. He said, "The reason why I lied to you and joked with you is actually to prepare you mentally. After all, the content of the next chapter is the beginning of the real plot of the comic Steins Gate. If you observe rashly without being mentally prepared, I'm worried that you, my beloved cat, will die suddenly." "Thank you so much." He gritted his teeth and said his words of thanks. This is a special skill that Yoshida has learned and mastered since he met a certain middle school cartoonist. A middle school cartoonist. Author, MaleProtagonist. Chapter 720. Despair is an important component of human life, but it is also the feeling that humans hate the most. The so-called despair is a feeling in the heart when you lose hope and are extremely eager but cannot get a response. This feeling is very painful, especially when hope is completely gone. Humans will personally experience the unspeakable depression. When humans first begin to despair, they will curl up in a dark and closed place and cry desperately. After that, they will begin to be afraid and hesitant about everything and everyone. For a long time, they will be trapped in the vortex alone. When humans realize that they have no hope in the future, their three views begin to collapse. The mental pain and loneliness will make humans have the idea of destroying themselves and cutting off their connection with the world. In the comic Steins Gate, when the male protagonist Okabe Rentaro saved Mayuri, he was deeply trapped in the darkness called despair because he had cut off hope. Readers who have read the manga Steins Gate after the development of the plot may not forget that in a certain episode, the protagonist Okabe Rentaro, who was tortured by despair and wanted to end his life to stop the infinite cycle of not being able to save Mayuri from continuing, at that time, Rentaro really had the idea of committing suicide, wanted to cut off the connection with the whole world, and fell into the abyss of despair. Although later, under the encouragement of his assistant Makas Kurisu, the protagonist Rentaro finally found a way to save Mayuri, but in the process of turning theory into practice, Rentaro ushered in another more desperate thing. If you want to save Mayuri, you must choose to give up saving Maka's Kurasuke. Someone once said that the so-called despair is usually not the kind of helplessness of being forced into a desperate situation, but because you have not found the hidden hope that comes with despair. In other words, hope often appears together with despair. But in fact, only those who have truly experienced despair will understand how difficult it is to find hidden hope. So, seeing hope but being unable to change the status quo, that is the real despair that makes people feel helpless. Just like in the plot of this new episode of the manga Steins Gate, when the male protagonist Okabe Rentaro used the words of Naka Nizuki to vent his weakness, pain, and helplessness, the light of hope suddenly flashed again in the abyss of despair. Amanon Suzuha took the time machine again and brought a glimmer of hope to the desperate Rentaro. Rentaro, who saved the world by changing the world line, needs to save Maka's Kurasuke this time. Saving Maka's Kurasuke is not only a personal consideration, but also to save the world. The twists and turns of the plot made Yoshida, who was observing the comic manuscript, excited instantly. After all, for any reader who has been observing the comic serialization to date, the painful but helpless choice of the male protagonist Okabe Rentaro in the previous episode is really too depressing. So, this episode suddenly has this kind of bright future. Whether Yoshida is a reader or an editor, he is quite satisfied. Ah Cheng, is this a revelation? Yoshida, the editor in charge, speculated, looked up and secretly peeked at a certain middle school manga artist who was thinking about life, suppressed the restlessness of the complaining soul in his heart, and lowered his head to continue observing the manga manuscript. For humans, there are many cruel things, because humans treat the whole world so cruelly, so the world directly or indirectly feeds back to humans is also equally cruel. No, perhaps in a sense, what the world feeds back to humans is just a reference to what humans do, and it is returned to humans in different ways, regardless of kindness and evil. Therefore, the kindest people in the world are humans, and the cruelest are also humans. Even if you do something with good intentions, it will also bring unimaginable cruel results. Making a promise but not being able to fulfill it, giving hope but not being able to complete a miracle, for people in despair, this is definitely the cruelest thing, nothing else. Just like the personal experience of the male protagonist Okabe Rentaro in this episode of the comic manuscript. The reappearance of Amanon Suzuha awakened Rentaro's fighting spirit, allowing this man who had originally fallen into the abyss of despair to struggle back from the other side again. With the information provided by Amanon Suzuha, Rentaro, who had already given up hope, found a glimmer of hope to save his assistant Maka's Kurasuke again. It was precisely because of this plot that Yoshida couldn't help but slander and complain about a certain middle school cartoonist in his heart having a change of heart, and even had a strange idea like the cartoonist who completed this episode of the comic manuscript couldn't be a fake Howinkuma. However, when Yoshida really continued to observe the subsequent plot, he suddenly realized that the so-called hope was actually just to create a more desperate situation, that's all. In the second half of this episode of the comic, the protagonist Okabe Rentaro finally made up his mind and decided to save his assistant Maka's Kurasuke. Based on the information and analysis provided by Amanon Suzuha before, both Rentaro as the person involved and Yoshida as the observer felt that saving Maka's Kurasuke would be a matter of course. However, the last part of the comic book slapped Rentaro and Yoshida hard. This development. After reading the comic book, Yoshida showed an unbelievable look on his face. After hesitating for a moment, he immediately roared at a certain Chuyuni cartoonist, "Aiken, you are courting death, bastard." The reason why Yoshida lost his composure was naturally because at the end of the comic book, Rentaro, who originally wanted to save Maka's Kurasuke, became the culprit of Maka's Kurasuke's death by mistake. If it was just like this, Yoshida might have suppressed his emotions a little because he was familiar with the bad taste of a certain Chuyuni cartoonist. But the real cruelty was that in the comic, Rentaro knelt down and confided in a weak monologue after the action failed. Just one failure. Just this one time, I already know. According to the theory of world line convergence, on this world line, Maka's Kurasu's death has become an inevitable event, that is to say, no matter what I do next, on this world line, Kurasu's death is inevitable. Do you know how many times I have experienced this feeling of despair? Now I can be sure that the comic draft of this episode was definitely drawn by you, Cheng. Yoshida closed the comic draft fiercely, staring at a certain Chuyunibu cartoonist with an ugly expression, because only people like you, Cheng, will use hope as bait to complete the layout of despair. So, my cat, doing good deeds unilaterally may not always bring hope. Looking at Yoshida's somewhat dejected look, a certain middle school cartoonist nodded with satisfaction, and sighed, it is also likely to bring, suffocating despair. While bringing hope, it will also offer complete despair. Perhaps only the cartoonist Feng Guangaiyu and Kyoma can show this kind of devilish method of playing with people's hearts through comics. It is okay to have good intentions, but when doing good deeds, you must also feel sorry. Dear readers, good night. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. A middle school cartoonist. Author, MaleProtagonist. Chapter 721. The story about the self-contradiction must have become a well-known illusion. If the guy who sells spears and shields becomes a heroic spirit, he will have a shield that can't be broken except by the spear in his hand and a shield that can't be broken except by the shield in his hand. Defense spear, these two treasures will definitely make a powerful spearman. Of course, according to the tradition of spearmen reading Lucky E and writing Lucky Negative, even if the legendary master becomes a heroic spirit, he will definitely be deceived in various ways because of the illusion of self-contradiction. Out of the Holy Grail War. By the way, back then, a certain Bronze Xiaoqiang was tricked by a friend who was also cheating because of the illusion of self-contradiction. Therefore, according to the rules of the universe, the successful activation of the explosive armor is a masterpiece. Any guy who sets the self-contradictory flag will end up being like the legendary merchant, and will be snapped by all kinds of things. Slap in the face. It is destined to be a tragic result from the source. If you want to change it, unless you have the qualifications to change your destiny, the end will basically be the same. The reason why I say this is because a certain middle-class cartoonist once set a flag similar to self-contradiction in the comic Steins Gate. If the ending can only save one person, then the manga by Xiaomain Kuma-sensei will be a complete failure. Looking at the editor-in-chief Yoshida and editor-in-chief Yujiro, who were sitting upright in front of them, the new wife Ag squatted with her legs crossed on the chair. But since Mr. Kuma from the Phoenix Institute dares to draw a plot like Must Save Assistant Chan after the plot of Saving Mayuri, the only answer is, Mr. Kuma from the Phoenix Institute. In fact, I have already thought of the best of both worlds. That's true, but the plot of the last episode. Regarding Eiji's speculation, Yoshida pointed to the weekly magazine on the table and said helplessly, what about that desperate plot? What's going on? Mr. New Wife, please don't tell me, that's the worst of both worlds. Hey, Yoshida-san, I just promised to bring you here to meet the new wife. Listening to Yoshida questioning the cartoonist under his command, Yujiro, who was silently making soy sauce on the side, immediately showed his dissatisfaction. I don't remember that. I promised you to question Shinzuma-kun. Besides, Yoshida-san, if you can't interpret the manga of Phoenix Academy's Kuma-san, please ask me personally. Yujiro, do you think I don't want to? Yoshida suddenly reached out and grabbed Yujiro's shoulders, put on a desolate look as if he couldn't bear to look back on the past, and started to cry with tears. Don't think you will be used as a drama by that guy Aiken. He refused for a weird reason like Toru will die. If I had asked a few more times, I would have been turned into a silkworm chrysalis and hung up. Yoshida-san, it's not easy for you. After a moment of silence, Yujiro, whose mouth kept twitching, sighed with emotion. Speaking of the short period of silence before, Yujiro must have imagined some indescribable scenes. Ah ha ha ha, you really have the style of Mr. Kuma from the Phoenix Academy. Regarding Yashida's tragic experience, Eiji, the new wife, laughed loudly without any mercy. Then he turned his eyes to Yujiro and said thoughtfully, "But this is indeed a very useful method. If someone asks me about the follow-up plot of the comic again in the future, I will do the same." Yujiro noticed the peeping eyes of his new wife Eiji. After a moment of silence, he raised his hand and patted Yashida hard on the back. "Ah!" Hiss. Yashida was gasping for breath, looking at Yujiro with an evil expression, and roared angrily, "Hey, Yujiro, why are you hitting me? I'm just unhappy for no reason, humph." "Hey. Yujiro, you guy." Just when Yujiro was about to start an angry argument with the gloomy-looking Yashida, he unexpectedly discovered that his new wife, Eiji, suddenly jumped off the chair, walked quickly to the bookshelf, and took out a certain magazine from among the many weekly magazines that the other party neatly kept. "Flip through the weekly issue of Shounen Jump quickly. Arizuma-kun, are you looking for something?" After watching Arima Eiji change 5 weekly magazines in succession, Yujiro realized that the other party seemed to be looking for something, so he immediately stopped arguing with Yashida primary school student style, asked the new wife Eiji, "Do you need our help? Although I can't predict what kind of plot Mr. Kuma of the Phoenix Institute plans to draw next, but as early as when the comic Steins Gate started to be serialized, Mr. Kuma of the Phoenix Institute had already given a hint. That's it." Nyaizuma Eiji changed the magazine in his hand again, flipping through it quickly, and explained, "Phoenix and Master Jigen said before, I found it, I found it." "What did you find?" The two editors who were arguing just now suddenly stood in the same camp and asked in unison. However, it is a pity that Eiji Nyaizuma did not continue to finish what he had just said in the middle. Instead, he stopped where he was and started to flip through the weekly magazine in his hand. Compared with the previous mode of quickly flipping through observations, Eiji Nyaizuma read very slowly this time. As if he was completing a high-precision homework, and he didn't dare to be distracted in any way. Yashida stopped Yujiro, who was about to ask further questions, and shook his head slightly to signal him not to interfere with Eiji Nyaizuma, who was observing the comics, because Eiji Nyaizuma was in a state at this moment that Yashida had seen in a certain middle-class manga artist. The new wife-kun now won't pay attention to anything except comics. Looking at Yuichiro's curious eyes, Yashida pulled him back a little, and then whispered, "According to Cheng, in other words, this is the state of the legendary Mingjing Shisui's heart. Of course, I personally prefer that Shinzuma-kun is highly focused on the comics in his hands at the moment." So at this time, Yujiro instantly understood Yashida's words, and then asked helplessly, "Can we just wait quietly without saying a word?" "Well, even if Yujiro takes off all your clothes and runs away, the new wife won't even look at you," Yashida instructed with a calm expression. "If you don't believe it, Yujiro, you can give it a try." Although this metaphor is a little weird, Yashida said that his 2 titles of Sinister and Venomous Tongue on the editorial side are not in vain. "Yashida-san, do you think I'm a fool?" "Well, it seems that the 2 editors in primary school student status are about to start a second round of war." As expected, Eiji Nyaizuma didn't spend too much time. No, in other words, Eiji Nyaizuma already had the answer in his heart. He was observing the comics again just to verify his answer. In this way, the self-contradictory plot constructed in the previous plot has been beautifully resolved. As expected, the teacher of the Phoenix Academy Kumamoto is super awesome. "Shinzuma-kun, what do you understand?" The 2 editors looked at each other and immediately reached in truce agreement with their eyes, and then spoke in unison again. "Speaking of Yujiro and Yashida, do you 2 really not consider the possibility of being together?" "Since Mr. Kuma from the Phoenix Academy didn't say anything, I won't tell you." Faced with the curious eyes of the 2 editors in charge, Eiji Nizuma gave an answer that was beyond their expectations. The reason why this masterpiece is called a masterpiece, if I tell you in advance, I will feel that it is blasphemy to this comic. And I was able to see through the final foreshadowing only based on the prompts from Mr. Kuma of the Phoenix Academy. In Yuichiro's surprised eyes, Eiji Nizuma put the rummaged-over weekly magazines back on the bookshelf, and then used a slightly disappointed expression. He said in a tone of voice, "If there hadn't been any previous reminder, I might have said the same thing as Yuichiro-san. All in all, I am really convinced that I lost this time." Until Yoshida left, he didn't ask his new wife Eiji what the Phoenix Academy's murderous reminder was. "Hey, Nizuma-kun, I just wanted to ask." Yujiro, who saw Eiji Nizuma drawing the manga with a smile on his face and did not leave with Yoshida, finally couldn't help but ask the doubt in his heart, "Why? How do you feel about your mood today?" "I'm happy because I lost." Nizuma Eiji's hand holding the pen paused, and he raised his head and showed a bright smile to Yuichiro. "It's precisely because I lost that I feel very happy." "Will you still be happy after losing to Phoenix Academy, Kuma-sensei?" Yujiro looked puzzled, "But I remember before, Nizuma-kun, you said you don't like losing, right? Isn't this a contradictory statement?" "It's precisely because I lost that I know what I'm lacking. I can be aware of my own shortcomings and find ways to learn and improve. Compared to a short-term victory or defeat, it's worth being happy if you're still making progress and moving forward. Talk about things. So, this is not contradictory." A middle school cartoonist. Author, MaleProtagonist. Chapter 722. Under the guidance of Rina, Yoshida gently opened the door and saw a scene that made him doubt his life. Finally, the prince and princess lived a happy life in the castle. After closing the book and placing it on the bedside, he helped Rin, who had fallen asleep, pull the quilt. A certain middle-level mangaka in a white coat gently closed the door and faced Yoshida, who was looking surprised. Punched without any hesitation or politeness, causing Yoshida to hold his stomach and fall into the orts state. Chang, you guy." Yoshida, who originally wanted to roar, immediately lowered his voice unconsciously after feeling the murderous look in the eyes of a certain middle-grade cartoonist. "Why did you hit me suddenly? First, you actually dared to peek into my little princess's room. Second, you actually dared to complain about me in your heart." A certain middle-class cartoonist slowly drew out his magic sword, stared at Yoshida expressionlessly, and lowered his voice. Sheng said, "So, my beloved cat, you actually asked me why? You should be a little more conscious." "I'm just curious." Yoshida rubbed his belly and spread his hands helplessly. "Who would have thought that a guy like you, Cheng, would act like a normal father and do the same thing as talking your child to sleep? Previous story, this kind of thing." "Oh, my beloved cat, then in your memory, what kind of father should I be?" Makoto Takahashi stared at Yoshida with squinted eyes, a very pleasant expression on his face, took out his mobile phone from his white coat with his left hand. "Based on your answer, my beloved cat, I will take different actions: hack you to death or let the police officer take away you, the peeping, voyeuristic demon. Neither action would be a good thing. Let's talk about business, Chang." Yoshida just spent a second complaining in his heart, and then immediately started to change the topic seriously. "The reason why I came to see you so late, Chang, you should know that too, right?" "I don't know." A certain middle school cartoonist seemed to still have resentment towards Yoshida. He shook his head and said angrily, "No matter what the reason is for you, my familiar cat, but you dare to peek at my little one, the sleeping posture of the princess, huh? My beloved cat, you should know that you have committed a sin that cannot be forgiven even if you die 10,000 times. Hey, I apologize. I'm very sorry." Looking at the unwilling look of a certain middle-class cartoonist and the cold lighting magic sword in his right hand, Yoshida suddenly had the thought, if I don't apologize now, maybe I won't be able to do it today. The feeling of leaving safely. Tisk, such an insincere apology, my beloved cat, I really want to kill you now. Although a certain second-grade cartoonist said this, he still slowly returned the magic sword to its scabbard. And at the same time, he did not forget to ask, so my beloved cat, you came to see me this late at night. Did something happen? Was there an explosion on the editorial side of the weekly? Or is this place going to become the battlefield of the Holy Grail War? Woolen cloth. The manga Steins Gate has entered its final chapter. Yoshida ignored the complaints of a middle-class cartoonist. Instead, after a moment of silence, he suddenly asked, "Is that so, Chen?" "Oh, that's good. My familiar cat, you can guess the general development of the plot, and finally made some progress." A certain second-grade cartoonist was stunned for a moment, and then immediately showed a playful smile on his face. "Originally, that's what I want to say. It's a pity that my beloved cat, if you didn't seek help from the King of Black Flame, maybe I could give you a higher rating. I went to Mr. A.G. Niizuma for help, Chen, do you know?" Yoshida was a little amazed at the ability of a certain middle-level cartoonist to collect information. "So that means that Mr. A.G. Niizuma guessed the ending of your comic, Chen, and these things about admitting defeat, Chen, you also know." "Of course. I am the arrogant demon god of the Phoenix Academy," Makoto Takahashi answered Yoshida confidently, while silently deleting the call history of AG's new wife on his mobile phone. "So, the comic Steins Gate is coming to an end." Sure enough, the King of Black Flame is an interesting opponent." Makoto Takahashi, who squinted his eyes, wondered whether it was because he recalled the phone call with his new wife AG. After a moment of silence, he sighed, "But it's a pity. What's more, I encountered someone as cheating as me." "So Chen?" After hesitating for a moment, Yoshida couldn't help but ask, "What you said before, are you serious?" "That thing." After thinking for a moment, Makoto Takahashi showed a look of surprise on his face and replied without hesitation, "Of course. Because that is Steins Gate's choice." "Is it Steins Gate's choice again?" Yoshida curled his lips helplessly and said helplessly, "Although I know it's unlikely, I still want to persuade you." "My beloved cat, stop your incompetent and stupid persuasion." Although he said sarcastic words, the face of a certain middle-level cartoonist was quite serious at this moment. Just like human beings, no matter how much they contribute to the world, will eventually die. No matter how interesting the story is, it will eventually end. As the editor in charge, this truth should you know it too. "Yes, I know. But, I think it would be such a pity if the manga Steins Gate ends like this." Yoshida seemed a little excited and took out a copy of Steins Gate from his briefcase drawer. I took a deep breath and continued my great cause of persuasion. "Chen, let's not mention that the single volume of this comic is currently selling like hotcakes, judging from the plot of the entire work. In fact, the comic Steins Gate can still add new plots and continue to be serialized." "My familiar cat, you seem to have said something very interesting." After hearing Yoshida's words, Takahashi Makoto was stunned for a moment, and then asked, "By continuing the serialization, are you planning to start from the last one?" In the plot, it starts with Rentaro's failed rescue operation and serializes the plot of the world line in which Rentaro lives after accepting the death of his assistant. "Sure enough, Chen, you actually want to continue the serialization, right?" The plot he conceived suddenly came to him, and was actually told directly by Makoto Takahashi. Yoshida did not feel frustrated, but felt a little excited. "Although I refuse with my mouth, I have already thought about the next plot a long time ago." "Tisk tisk, Chen, I didn't realize that you actually have the attribute of Tsundere. It's a pity, my familiar cat, I refuse to continue the series in that way." Ignoring Yoshida's complaints about himself, Takahashi Makoto calmly refused. "Eh? Why? According to the plot you just mentioned, Chen, it can still be serialized for a while. As long as the manga Steins Gate is still being serialized, I will still be a mangaka, my familiar cat. You want to use this method to dispel my idea of retiring, right? Takahashi-chan shook his head in disdain and said in a tone of disgust, you, haven't you considered the feelings of the protagonist Rentaro? Huh? Rentaro's feelings. For humans as observers, observing the entire story or observing a certain life experience of the protagonist in the story does not mean that they have observed the entire life of the protagonist. There is no work that can describe it in detail. The whole life of a certain character is recorded in it, right? A certain middle-level cartoonist suddenly exuded an aura of decadence and sighed helplessly. However, in order to extend the serialization, my family is cat. You actually want me to continue planning Rentaro's life? How cruel is this? Cruel, your sister. I apologize to the people all over the world who write novels and draw comics, Hundan. Listening to the bizarre theories of a certain middle-class cartoonist, the corners of Yoshida's mouth kept twitching. In short, my beloved cat, I have decided. When Rentaro arrives in the Steins Gate world line, it will be the day when the manga Steins Gate ends. Similarly, it's also the day when cartoonist Hohoin Koshin retires.